Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see everybody here. Now, as you can see, I've got Tom Arnold next to me. I think, well, it's an understatement, really, to say that the world is facing so many global challenges. Geopolitical, obviously, economic inequality, which I think is probably one of the most difficult challenges I think the world is facing, but also climate change. So in this session, we're going to start with a big picture look at some of those challenges, and then also have a special focus on Africa, keeping a constant eye, of course, on issues of food security and food safety. So, as I said, I'm with Tom Arnold, who is the chair of the Island Africa Rural Development Committee. So we're navigating many global challenges today. How would you define the main challenges? I know I've just mentioned three that we're facing.
Well, if we look to the next, say, to 2050, and assuming that we don't blow ourselves up in the meantime, I think there's two core challenges. The first one is how to provide safe and nutritious food for a growing population, a population likely to grow from the current 8 billion to 10 billion. And do this in a way which doesn't heat up the globe beyond, manages global warming to, if possible, not beyond 1.5%. In fact, it's already beyond 1.5%, so we have a very big challenge. The thing is that if we look at those two existential challenges, we need to recognize that we actually have an agenda already in place to tackle them in the shape of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Each of them agreed in 2015. Now we're in 2025. Neither of those agreements are on track, but there are subsidiary agreements which are in place to try to get them on track. And there's 4 meetings this year in particular, 2025, which are pertinent to those two interconnected goals. The first one was held last week in Paris, the Nutrition for Growth Summit. The second one is the UN Food System Summit +4, which is happening in July. And the third one is COP30 in November in Brazil. And the really important point is that the interconnectedness between these 3 agendas at these 3 meetings is hugely important. But we now have another factor, which is, dates from the 20th of January, and it's the impact of President Trump.
Well, exactly. So that brings me to my next question in some respects, perfectly, because, the US administration, whichever side of the political divide you are on, has made massive cuts to foreign aid, and that is having global repercussions. You can't open the paper, open a website for news without seeing those repercussions. So what impact do you see this happening? And it's very short term already, but what impacts are you seeing already in terms of food security and food safety? And how do you project that this is going to what repercussions will this have longer term?
Well, let's look at the impact from 2 perspectives. One is the human impact, and second, the political impact. The human impact is already clear. Well, first of all, the scale of the cuts. In 2023, US provided $73 billion in foreign aid. When the decision in January, they're cutting 60 billion of that. So it's has huge impact, not just on what America does with its aid, but in all the other institutions like the UN, like NGOs, like other organizations. All of those are massively impacted. Now, what impact will it have? Well, it's having immediate impact. And one of the major, most acute ones will be in the issue of severe acute malnutrition for children. That's being seriously damaged. Another one is, of course, the cutback in the program called PEPFAR, which is HIV/AIDS. And that's only the short-term measures. And I mean, Bill Gates said that these could lead to a basic erosion of the progress made in global health over the years. And he said it could lead to millions of deaths. So that's without taking the longer-term issue into account. Now, what about the political dimension? These impacts are inevitably going to have, I would say, a very damaging effect on America's reputation. The cost, the human cost of them, straight away. But then, it's America first is, the absolute opposite to the world that America created after the Second World War.
But we wanted to argue the devil's advocate here. Since these cuts have come into play, many countries have followed suit as well.
Yeah.
The United Kingdom, for example, has massively cut its aid budget in terms to give more money to defense.
Yeah.
The European Union has done the same. So this is almost a global movement.
It's a global movement, and it is a new reality that the level of foreign aid that we've been used to for the last 2 decades is not going to be there any longer. And it means that there's a whole set of new challenges which the world needs to face. So to some extent, Trump has shocked the world into assessing what it does about the big problems. And what the answer to that is, or at least the response to that is that I think aid has to be smarter and more effective, given.
Was it not smart enough before?
I think the people who were critical of it could point to the fact that for the most part, it was doing a lot of good work, but they could be critical of aspects of it. But now, if you look at if America has taken itself off the stage, who steps in? How can other people, other governments, rise to the occasion? And it's not just governments. The whole point is that it's the private sector, it's civil society, it's universities. And we're always going to have to think more strategically about how to work towards these big challenges.
Well, because it's interesting, because I think you attended the Nutrition for Growth conference in Paris this February.
Last week.
Last week.
Yeah.
The US wasn't there.
US decided not to come.
So what kind of impact did it have? Because, are other countries, other leaders stepping into the breach?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the metrics from last week, the amount of financial pledges towards nutrition were actually somewhat up on the pledges that were made 4 years ago in Tokyo. But it's not just money, it's about smarter policy. Mm-hmm. And one of the, I would say, notable achievements last week was the adoption of something called the Compact for Nutrition Integration.
Okay.
The idea that basically nutrition should be built into as an integral part of other policies, health policies, food policies. I mean, it might seem obvious to say that nutrition should be built into food policies, but it hasn't always been. Nutrition hasn't got the attention that it has needed. So that's an advance. And there's other things. I mean, there was one example last week, for example, of 4 philanthropies coming together to commit $250 million to focus particularly on maternal nutrition, which we're making sure that pregnant women, were getting what they call MMS, multiple multivitamin supplements, which for the most part happens here in the developed world, but doesn't happen in the developing world. So there's lots to do and lots of smarter policies that could be in place, and that's what we need to be focused on.
You say that, obviously, and this is, I suppose, there's a lot more awareness, as you're saying, in the Western world regarding this. But I was looking at some figures in Africa, and 50% of African women are likely to be obese by 2030. Yeah. And we're seeing an obesity epidemic globally. This comes back to your point regarding nutritious food and healthy food. So when in terms of Africa, do you feel that this is going to be a continent that's going to be left behind, given what we're seeing globally, given the cuts that you're talking about? Or do you think these more sensible policies are going to be able to take hold there in time?
Well, if we first of all start with where Africa is at the moment, and it's not in a good place. From a nutrition point of view, it has a major problem of undernutrition, and that's meaning that in many African countries, you have stunting rates of between 30 and 50%. That's a major, major problem, because stunting is effectively a mortgage on a country's future. And then it's also the case, it is the reality that obesity is becoming also a problem. And, it's interesting how the term malnutrition has changed in meaning, or the proper meaning has come in place over the last 15 years. When we talked about malnutrition before, we were actually really talking about undernutrition. But malnutrition consists of undernutrition, overweight and obesity, and micronutrient deficiencies. So if we think about nutrition, we have to think in that more holistic term and approach it in that way. There are positive things happening in Africa, in a number of countries. Leave aside, one of the major problems, of course, in Africa is in those countries where conflict is a reality, and that's really should be a first priority, deal with conflict. And because if you don't deal with it, you're not going to make any other strides. But if African countries are committed to making progress, improving their nutritional status is absolutely foundational. Getting their agriculture and rural economy working more effectively is another core part of the foundation. And Africa has the African Union adopted just in January of last year, a new approach towards policy in this regard.
Is this the Kampala Declaration?
It's the Kampala Declaration. Africa has had an agricultural policy for the last 20 years.
So why is the Kampala Declaration different, and what impact will that have?
First of all, it's beyond. It's not just about agriculture. It's about agriculture and food and nutrition. It takes a lot more account of the reality of climate change, and that has to be addressed as well. And this Kampala Declaration, I think, is a real, a very important statement of African political commitment to this. The problem is, for the last 10 years, you've had the political commitment and you've had the proper policy framework. You haven't had the proper implementation. So the challenge now is if Africa now has reset its policy and political commitment for the future, it also has to do something much more effective about implementation.
And then this comes back to this question of huge aid cuts, because I imagine implementation would have been facilitated by a certain amount of aid.
Yeah.
So what has been discussed, or what is being discussed, to try and circumvent that?
Well, I think there basically needs to be a realization that it's in all our interests to make Africa a successful continent. Africa is the only part of the world where population is growing. Population will double between now and 2050. So Africa, in many ways, is a continent of opportunity. There's a lot of things, positive things happening in terms of improved governance. There's a number of countries are doing well, but there's a core set of countries at the bottom. The World Bank counts them about 26 that are in such a very bad state that more or less fundamental investment needs to be get that investment just to help them get going. But a lot of other African countries are at a stage where they themselves have to accept the fact that the levels of aid are no longer going to be there. They're going to have to take harder decisions themselves about how they get investment through blended finance or other forms of assistance, and looking at their own resources that they can contribute to their own development. So in a way, Mr. Trump is a sort of a cold shock to so many countries and peoples around the world, But there has to be now a basic reassessment in the part of many countries, in Africa in particular, as to how they're going to chart their own development course from now on.
And that reassessment process is clearly underway. One thing I forgot to say, we're going to have a Q&A session after this, if you didn't see this in the agenda. So if you do have any questions, do jot them down, and then we can post them to give them to Tom just straight after. So as you said, there are a number of important meetings that are going to be taking place. Now, I think the Kampala Declaration was important, as you say, because it does put climate change, nutrition, health, food systems all in the same space.
Yeah.
If we're going to focus now on climate change and the COP30 conference, now there has been a certain amount of what people would say backsliding in the previous COP30s, a lot of hope in what might happen in Brazil in November. What are you expecting to see at this conference in a best case scenario? And then maybe give us the things that you're worrying about in terms of the worst case scenario and what could happen.
Well, the best case scenario is that it's been run by, I think, a government with a deep commitment to what it's about in COP30, the Brazilian government, and a competent administration to back it up. The other thing is that this is the first COP started in 1995, and for all of those years in between, the COP meetings paid little or no attention to the link between climate and food. Climate and food are at the center of this COP. And there's another dimension which is of particular relevance to Ireland, in that the Brazilians have set up what they call a global alliance against hunger and nutrition. So to put the link between hunger and nutrition at the center of the link between climate and food. So the best case scenario is that people turn up to this meeting the Brazilians are working at the moment what they call an action agenda, which they bring to a meeting of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, in June. And that action agenda will be negotiated between June and November. And the hope is that it will actually come up with a solid set of proposals backed by financial resources, although it has to be said that the Americans taking themselves off the stage is going to have an impact on the whole area of climate finance. But if we go back to your best case scenario, I think it could be that we begin to move this item of climate, food, and nutrition right up to close to the top of the international political agenda.
Okay.
So the worst case scenario is that doesn't happen.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of, if we go back, pull our focus back onto Africa again, and the issue of climate change, which is increasingly impacting kind of agricultural production, what are you seeing in terms of the safety risks at the moment? Obviously, there's going to be questions of food security, but how is climate change maybe also impacting issues of food safety? And then after that, we'll look at the adaptation strategies on the ground, and then we'll take some questions.
Well, I mean, food safety, we have to see food safety as just a foundational issue for food security. And Africa and many other countries made commitments in 2021, recognizing that food system change was central to achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And now, 4 years on from that, we are looking at this in Addis Ababa at the end of July, where countries have got to in their commitments to move that along. But food safety, I mean, we looked at various aspects in the last 2 days of this. Africa has some major